Maybe everything you call detachment is actually your most sophisticated prison. You think you've freed yourself, but you keep checking your phone 3 times in 5 minutes. You think you don't care, but you lose sleep because someone didn't answer a message. You think you've evolved, but you're just more tired, more distant, more protected by a wall you mistake for wisdom. What's being sold today under the name of detachment is a carefully crafted counterfeit, wrapped in pretty phrases and scattered quotes, designed to keep you exactly where you are while making you believe you've changed. And 700 years ago, a German thinker named Meister Eckhart was already warning about this exact confusion, with words that still cut deep for anyone brave enough to read them. You're about to discover what he really meant and why it might dismantle the way you're living right now. Most of the people who talk about detachment have never read a single line of Meister Eckhart. They repeat what they heard in some video, in some airport bookstore paperback, in some conversation that was just a repetition of an earlier conversation. The word has become decoration. People sprinkle detachment into a sentence the way you'd season bland food, hoping it'll add flavor to a life that remains tasteless on the inside. The result is predictable. People who say they've detached from money check their bank balance 3 times a day. People who claim to live in the present mentally rewrite old conversations, searching for what they could have said better. The term has become a disguise, a mask placed over the fear of admitting how trapped one still is. Eckhart von Hochheim was born around 1260 in what is now Thuringia, Germany. He joined the Dominican order while still young, studied in Paris, taught in Strasbourg and Cologne, and became one of the most influential preachers of his time. Picture the setting where he spoke. Dark stone churches, lit only by the yellow glow of thick wax candles, filled with men and women wrapped in heavy fabrics, their calloused hands resting on tired knees, listening to that voice echo against the cold walls. But what set Eckhart apart wasn't the setting, it was what he said. He preached in vernacular German, the language of butchers, shoemakers, women tending their children by the winter fire. And he didn't soften anything. He spoke of a point inside the human being that belongs to no one, not even to the person who carries it. His words were so strange that the church put him on trial. In 1329, after his death, a papal bull called In Agro Dominico condemned 28 propositions drawn from his writings. The most profound figure of medieval Christian mysticism was declared suspect. And even so, centuries later, he is still read. Schopenhauer cited him in the world as will and representation. Heidegger studied him obsessively in the final years of his life. D.T. Suzuki, the great introducer of Zen to the West, found in Eckhart a kindred spirit separated by oceans and centuries, and wrote about that closeness in his book, Mysticism, Christian and Buddhist, published in 1957. The context in which Eckhart lived is worth remembering, because it helps explain the weight of what he was saying. The 14th century was one of the darkest periods in European history. The Black Death was about to sweep away a third of the continent's population. Wars dragged on for decades. The Church, divided between Rome and Avignon, was going through one of the greatest credibility crises in its history. And in the middle of that chaos, Eckhart would step up to the pulpit and tell ordinary people that the sacred wasn't located anywhere external, but inside the inner space of each person, that nobody needed to wait for ecclesiastical permission to access that dimension, that the real work was inner work, and that this work was available to anyone willing to do it. It was a politically dangerous message in a structure that depended on intermediation, and that's why he was put on trial. The trial began in Cologne in 1326. Eckhart, already elderly, defended himself firmly. He refused to admit heresy, but acknowledged that some of his formulations might have been misunderstood. He appealed to the Pope in Avignon. He traveled there, already ill, and died before the proceedings ended. It was a late attack on a man who could no longer defend himself, and that condemnation caused his work to be partially lost for centuries. Many manuscripts were hidden, copied in secret, preserved only in isolated monasteries. It wasn't until the 19th century that German scholars began gathering what remained in modern critical editions that continue to this day, and it's exactly what he said in those forgotten sermons that's going to dismantle you from here on out, because the central concept of his work dismantles the very idea you have of yourself. What Eckhart wrote can't be summed up in a paragraph, but there is one concept that runs through his entire body of work like a thread of steel. He called it Abgeschiedenheit. In English, it's poorly translated as detachment, withdrawal, separation. The original German term carries something more. It comes from the verb abscheiden, which means to cut away, to separate from, to distinguish oneself. It isn't a cowardly renunciation. It's a precise inner operation, almost surgical, in which the human being stops confusing himself with what dominates him. In the treatise von Abgeschiedenheit, probably written between 1300 and 1320, Eckhart states something that still unsettles anyone who reads it today. He says that detachment is the highest virtue of all, higher even than love, humility, and mercy, because without it, none of the other virtues can stand on their own. Right here, a problem becomes obvious. Most people think that being detached means not caring about anything, looking at life with that tired air of someone who has seen it all and no longer expects anything, building an emotional wall and calling it wisdom. But that isn't detachment. That's anesthesia mistaken for peace. And that confusion has serious consequences, because an entire generation is learning not to feel as if that were maturity. There are men who cut off close relationships and convince themselves they've evolved. There are women who shut themselves inside mechanical routines and call it self-care. Eckhart would have been horrified by this. What he proposed was exactly the opposite. For him, Abgeschiedenheit didn't mean abandoning the world. It meant no longer being dragged around by it. There's an enormous difference between the two. The one who abandons the world runs away. The one who lets go remains, but in a different way. He keeps working, keeps loving, keeps owning things, keeps having opinions. He simply stops being controlled by those things from the outside. The center of gravity shifts. Before, it came from circumstances. Now, it comes from a place more interior, more silent, more stable. It's like the difference between a leaf that floats wherever the wind blows it and a tree whose roots hold the trunk firm even in the storm. The leaf thinks it's free because it moves. The tree knows it's free because it doesn't need to move. Eckhart preached to bakers, merchants, housewives, widows, soldiers, not to hermits. In sermons collected in what is now known as the Deutsche Werke, he stated that it was possible to live detached in the middle of the marketplace, with hands sticky from bread dough, with small children tugging at the hem of one's dress. The inner gathering he described didn't require external silence. It required an inner posture in which the noise of the world stopped echoing in the depths of one's being. In a famous sermon, he said that the person who has to flee to a quiet place in order to find the sacred hasn't found it yet, because what he called God isn't located in any specific place. It's in that inner point that no noise can reach, as long as the person stops carrying the noise inside. And here things get interesting for anyone living right now, in a world that would have made Eckhart look like a prophet, because what imprisons the contemporary human being is no longer hunger, no longer cold, no longer war in the streets. It's a collection of invisible prisons. The salary that's never enough, the boss's opinion that echoes for days, the digital validation that hooks you like a slow-acting drug, the image you try to project and which slips through your fingers every time someone looks closely. You carry prisons that fit in your pocket. The screen lights up at 4 in the morning with a red notification, and your heart races before your brain even understands what happened. That's the symptom. The cause goes deeper. The more things pile up, the less room there is for presence. Eckhart said something similar in his sermons. He said that a being that's already full cannot receive anything new, just as a full glass cannot receive water. The drama of contemporary life is that it looks prosperous on the outside while being exhausted on the inside. There's more material comfort than at any other point in human history, more entertainment at our fingertips, and more options available to fill every free minute. And yet, according to recent international surveys by the Gallup Institute, levels of sadness, anger, and worry among adults in the Western world are among the highest ever recorded since that measurement began in 2006. Nothing is missing. And that's exactly why something essential is missing. Excess fills the space where meaning should fit. A study conducted by Harvard University, known as the Harvard Study of Adult Development, has been following the same people since 1938. It's the longest study on human happiness ever conducted. Robert Waldinger, the study's current director, published a book in 2023 called The Good Life, in which he summarizes 85 years of findings in one central conclusion. The quality of relationships is the factor that most determines physical health and psychological well-being over the course of life. More than money, more than status, more than professional achievements. And what destroys relationships, according to that same study, is exactly the kind of possessive, anxious, dependent emotional prison that Eckhart was describing. The happiest people aren't the ones who had perfect lives. They're the ones who managed to develop relationships where the other person was allowed to be who they were instead of who they were needed to be. That scientific finding, 7 centuries later, empirically confirms what the German mystic had already intuited. There's also an observation by the Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman in his work Liquid Modernity, published in 2000, that speaks to this question. Bauman describes the current era as a time when solid structures have dissolved. Everything flows: relationships, jobs, identities, values. Nothing stays around long enough to take root. And in that liquid landscape, the human being finds himself paradoxically more clingy, not less. Because in the absence of stable reference points, he holds tighter to the little that seems firm, to a digital image of himself, to a consumption routine, to relationships he barely knows, with the intensity of someone afraid of being swallowed up by the general emptiness. Bauman doesn't mention Eckhart, but the description fits. Liquid modernity created ideal conditions for the multiplication of invisible attachments. And the German mystic, 7 centuries earlier, unknowingly offers an antidote that contemporary sociology has only just begun to rediscover. Eckhart had a name for the kind of person who managed to free themselves from this. He called them the edler Mensch, the noble man. The sermon Vom edlen Menschen, or On the Noble Man, is one of the most beautiful and unsettling pieces in his corpus. In that text, he describes the noble man not as the aristocrat by birth, not as the monk in his habit, not as the white-bearded sage. The noble man is the one who has discovered inside himself a point that no external circumstance can touch. That man can be poor and not suffer poverty, rich and not suffer wealth, alone and not suffer loneliness. It's not armor, it's a root. Something in him has already arrived home, and that home isn't located anywhere in the visible world. That's why he cannot be torn away from himself. This is the silent ideal Eckhart offers, and it's important to understand why it resonates so strongly with anyone who feels out of step with social norms. We live in a culture that defines worth by what is shown. Eckhart's noble man is defined by what isn't shown. There's an invisible dimension in him, non-transferable, undemonstrable. Those who find it recognize it. Those who lack it can't see it. No amount of talk can substitute for that quality of presence. It shows up in a gesture, in a silence, in a gaze that doesn't ask for approval. And it's rare, increasingly rare. Maybe that's why, in the middle of the inflation of characters and personas, there's a renewed interest in figures like Eckhart. Because what he offers is the opposite of the constant identity manufacturing that suffocates contemporary man. Here we arrive at the most disturbing point of his philosophy. Eckhart claimed that the greatest attachment to be broken isn't to external things like money, status, or relationships. It's the clinging to oneself, to one's own ego, one's own image, one's own story. There's a phrase attributed to him, repeated throughout his sermons, that goes something like this: as long as a person is clinging to what they believe themselves to be, they cannot receive what they actually are. The formulation sounds like a tongue twister, but it hits like a punch to the gut. It means that whoever clings to their own biography, to their achievements, to their traumas, to their labels, is blocking access to their own essence. The self that puts itself on display is not the self that is. And as long as the two are confused, freedom is not possible. This letting go of oneself is the point where most people give up. It's easy to talk about letting go of material possessions. It's hard to let go of the story you tell about yourself. Because without that story, who are we? The question makes you dizzy. And it's exactly inside that dizziness that Eckhart asks you to stay. He said that one had to empty oneself of oneself, in German sich entwerden, to become nothing, so that something real could emerge. It isn't nihilism. It isn't depression. It's the recognition that the surface self is a construction, and that beneath that construction, there's something more real, more quiet, more permanent. But to get there, you have to walk through a layer of discomfort that few people can endure. Most retreat at the first threat to their own narrative. They go back to clinging to the image. And they keep being unhappy without understanding why. Contemporary psychology has reached a similar conclusion, although through completely different paths. Research in neuroscience and clinical psychology over the past 2 decades has shown that many of today's psychological sufferings stem from the hyperactivity of what's usually called the narrative self. That narrative self is the inner voice that tells a continuous story about who we are, what we've accomplished, what we've failed at, what others think of us. When that voice becomes overly active, anxiety, depression, compulsive social comparison, and the inability to enjoy the present moment all emerge. Science doesn't speak of detachment, but the kind of quieting of that narrative self that science describes as healthy is virtually identical to what Eckhart was preaching in the 14th century. 7 centuries apart, different vocabularies, the same central intuition. Too much self is the poison. Reducing that internal pressure is the cure. There's an anecdote linked to Eckhart, though it may be apocryphal, that illustrates this well. The story goes that after months of studying with him, a disciple asked what the final secret of the path was. Eckhart supposedly answered with a short sentence: "Forget yourself." Not in the sense of putting yourself down, in the sense of stopping the attachment to your own character. The phrase, whether authentic or not, captures the essential. As long as the inner life is fascinated with itself, attached to its own image, mentally commenting on every single thing it does, there is no freedom. There is only a lonely performance that no one is watching, and that nevertheless consumes all the spectator's energy. Freeing yourself from that performance is perhaps the most transformative act a human being can devote himself to. When was the last time you spent 10 minutes alone with yourself, no phone, no music, nothing, and didn't need to escape? Understanding philosophy is interesting. Practicing philosophy can change your life. Start with the link I've pinned in the first comment. Eckhart had another concept, a sibling to detachment, that's worth bringing up. He spoke of Gelassenheit, a German word usually translated as serenity, but which literally means the state of letting be. It comes from the verb lassen, to release, to allow. Gelassenheit is the inner posture of someone who stops trying to control the uncontrollable. It isn't resignation or fatalism. It's the deep trust that reality has its own order, and that the constant attempt to force outcomes is, in itself, a form of suffering. The person who lives in Gelassenheit acts, but doesn't tense up, works, but doesn't contract, wants, but doesn't demand. There's a flexibility in him that comes from strength, not weakness. It's the serenity of someone who knows that, in the end, he controls almost none of what matters, and even so, he doesn't despair over it. That concept was recovered, centuries later, by Martin Heidegger in a text called Gelassenheit, published in 1959, in which he contrasts meditative serenity with the calculating posture of modern technology. Heidegger wasn't a mystic, but he recognized in Eckhart an intuition that helped him think about the relationship between contemporary man and the world. According to him, we live dominated by an end-framing mindset, in which everything is turned into a resource to be exploited. People become human resources. Time becomes an asset. Attention becomes a commodity. And in that general reduction, Gelassenheit appears as the way out. A way of being in the world that doesn't treat the world as raw material, that lets things be what they are, without needing to immediately turn them into utility. The paradox of detachment is that by letting go, you receive more. Eckhart stated this in several sermons, and it's one of the most counterintuitive ideas in his work. He said that the one who empties himself is the one who gets filled the most. The one who demands nothing from life receives everything. The one who abandons the obsessive search for meaning discovers the meaning hidden in the most ordinary moment. It's not a psychological trick. It's not a manifestation technique. It's a phenomenological observation about how human experience actually works. The tighter you squeeze a handful of sand, the more the sand slips through your fingers. The more you try to hold on to air, the less air you have. Life works in part by this same logic. The most precious things, when chased with greed, flee. When you leave space for them to arrive, often they do. That paradox has concrete applications. In relationships, especially. The one who smothers a partner with demands is the one who most often loses the partner. And the same goes for children, for friends, for any close bond. The heavier the pressure, the wider the distance that gets created. Love, observed up close, thrives in space. Without space, it suffocates. Eckhart understood this in a way that's still hard to absorb today. For him, true love is not possession. It's reverence. It's letting the other be who they are, without molding them to your own needs. And only someone who has let go of himself can love that way, because as long as ego is at the center, all love is, in the end, a disguised negotiation. The man who carries deep relational wounds tends to resist this idea. There's an old instinct that confuses love with control. If I love, I hold on. If I hold on, I don't lose. But anyone who's lived long enough knows that math is wrong. The one who holds too tightly loses sooner. The one who clenches his fist ends up alone with an empty hand. And even so, we repeat the pattern because the alternative, letting go, seems unbearable. It means trusting when there are no guarantees. It means facing the terror that the other person might not come back and still keep breathing. Eckhart asked, silently, that this courage be learned, that we learn to love without holding on, to be with someone without trapping them, to want without grabbing, not as a romantic technique, but as a way of existing. Developmental psychology has shown that there are different styles of emotional attachment formed in childhood and repeated throughout adult life. There's what's called secure attachment, which allows for stable and deep relationships precisely because the person doesn't need the other to feel whole. There are also the anxious and avoidant styles, both dysfunctional, which stem from a lack of inner-centeredness that turns the other person into either a crutch or a threat. What science describes as secure attachment is, in practical terms, very close to what Eckhart described as detached love. The internally stable person loves with presence, but not with dependence. They are open to the other, but not enslaved by them. This convergence between such distant bodies of knowledge isn't a coincidence. It's a sign that, in different eras, the same truth is being discovered about what makes a human relationship sustainable. Applying this in everyday life, though, is harder than understanding it intellectually. There's a big distance between knowing that detached love is better and actually being able to practice it at 3 in the morning, when the phone rings and the other person doesn't answer. The blue light of the phone lights up the pillow. The heart races before the thought even forms. WhatsApp shows the message was read with no reply, and in that moment, all the theories evaporate. What's left is raw panic, primitive urgency, the impulse to do something, anything, to reduce the anguish. And that's precisely the moment when the real work begins. Not in easy situations, in situations where the attachment shows up with all its force. Learning to breathe, to wait, to feel the fear without being dragged away by it. That doesn't happen in silent retreats. It happens in real life, with real people, in real situations that hit our oldest wounds. And here we arrive at what may be the most surprising point in all of this philosophy, and one that few people have the courage to face head-on. Let's look at a concrete example, because without it, all of this can sound abstract. Imagine 2 people who lose their jobs. the first one falls apart. Not because she's hungry, but because the job was what propped up her self-image. Without the title, she doesn't know who she is. Her identity collapses. The following months are a sequence of sleepless nights, desperate phone calls, attempts to win back what was lost in order to rebuild the character that was lost along with it. The second person also loses her job. She feels it. She mourns it. She reorganizes her budget. She goes to sleep. She wakes up the next day and starts moving, not because she's stronger or colder, but because the job was never the axis of her being. It was an activity she performed, not a piece of her that got torn off. That second person, maybe without realizing it, is closer to Eckhart's noble man than any practitioner of silent retreats who still hasn't broken the fixation on his own image as a spiritualized person. The difference between the two isn't circumstantial, it's structural. It lies in the way the self relates to what it owns or does, and that inner structure gets built. It doesn't come from birth. It doesn't come from luck. It comes from years of silent work in which the person gradually learns to distinguish what she is from what she has. It's work that nobody can do for you, and no external achievement can replace it. The automatic life is the opposite of all this, and it's where most people spend most of their days. They wake up to the sound of the alarm, check the phone before even thinking, drink coffee on autopilot, and head into another day that feels just like the one before. They react to the emails, they react to the meetings, they react to the gridlocked Monday morning traffic. They react to their partner until they collapse into bed again, without having actually chosen anything that happened in the previous 16 hours. Contemporary neuroscience describes this mode of functioning as a dominance of brain circuits oriented toward mechanical tasks, at the expense of contemplative capacity. Today's human being has lost the ability to pause, and that loss has deep consequences. Without pause, there is no real choice. Without real choice, there is no freedom. Without freedom, there is only the illusion of being alive. Detachment, for Eckhart, is what reintroduces the gap. It creates a space between stimulus and response, and inside that space, everything that matters fits. Reflection, decision, meaning, presence. Without that space, the human being is just a bundle of reflexes. He reacts the way a plant reacts to sunlight, without awareness of the movement. With the space, something emerges that can be called, cautiously, interiority. Not in the strict religious sense, but in the sense of a center that chooses, that weighs, that decides what to do with what comes its way. That, according to Eckhart, is the birth of the human. And that's why he spoke of detachment as a doorway. Everything passes through it. Without that door, nothing he described makes any sense. There's a sermon by Eckhart, known as Sermon 52, which begins with the famous line, Beati pauperes spiritu, blessed are the poor in spirit, and which he interprets in a way that scandalized his contemporaries. For him, the poor in spirit is not the one who has little, nor the one who accepts having little. It is the one who wants nothing, knows nothing, and has nothing in the most radical sense possible. Wants nothing because he is no longer moved by the mechanics of desire. Knows nothing because he has left behind the obsession with explaining and categorizing everything. Has nothing, not in the sense of material poverty, but in the sense of not being glued to any inner possession, not even to his own virtue. That poverty is, paradoxically, the greatest wealth, because whoever has reached that point cannot be touched by what normally drags other people around. He already is what he needs to be. Nothing more can be given to him, and nothing more can be taken from him. That sermon was one of the texts cited in the papal bull of 1329 as evidence of heresy, and it's not hard to understand why. In a religious structure based on hierarchies, sacraments, and mediations, saying that a human being can approach the divine directly, without needing even the rituals of the church, was a political threat. Eckhart didn't openly challenge the institutions, but what he said, taken to its ultimate consequences, emptied those institutions of their power. That's why he was put on trial. And that's why perhaps he remains relevant, because what he proposed is an adult spirituality, one that doesn't need middlemen, one that places responsibility on the human being himself, on his own inner gathering, on his own silence. And here, an unavoidable question arises. If detachment is so liberating, why do so few people actually practice it? The answer is simple and painful. Because most people prefer familiar suffering to unknown freedom. The ego suffers, but it's familiar. The very anxieties, as uncomfortable as they are, form the recognizable fabric of who one is. Letting go means stepping into territory where you no longer know what to call yourself. And that's terrifying. There's a passage by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard in his work The Concept of Anxiety, published in 1844, that describes this phenomenon precisely. Kierkegaard speaks of anxiety as the dizziness of freedom, when the human being realizes he can actually choose, that he isn't determined by anything external. He feels an emptiness that makes him dizzy. And often, instead of inhabiting that emptiness, he throws himself back into the familiar chains. He prefers the familiar prison to new freedom. Eckhart knew this, although he didn't use those words. His sermons repeatedly ask the listener not to flee from the emptiness, not to fill it with noise, not to run to the first available distraction. There's a phrase attributed to him, though the exact source is debated, that says the sacred isn't in the things that occupy the inside, but in the space that's left when those things withdraw. Whether that's truly his or a later paraphrase, it hardly matters. The idea runs through all his work. Compulsive filling is the enemy of deep experience. And modern life is basically a compulsive filling machine. Think about what happens when you stay silent for 10 minutes. Just 10. No phone, no music, no television, no book, no conversation. Just you and the still air of the room. The first thing that comes up is discomfort. Then, thoughts that were buried under the noise start to surface. Then, an almost irresistible urge to do something. Anything. Check the phone, wash some dishes, call someone, eat something. That impulse is the clearest sign of how deeply attached you are to the need to escape yourself. And it's also the point where the real work begins. Whoever endures that initial discomfort discovers, after a while, that it dissolves. And underneath it, slowly, something different emerges. A stillness, a sharper attention, a sense that being with yourself in the end isn't so terrible after all. Silence was a central practice for Eckhart. Not just physical silence, but inner silence. The silence that happens when you stop internally commenting on every event. When you see a flower without immediately classifying it, judging it, mentally photographing it. When you hear a sentence without already lining up your reply. When you're with someone without rehearsing your next argument. That silence is a form of respect for what's real. It lets things appear as they are, without the constant filter of mental commentary. And for the human being today, trained since childhood to maintain a continuous inner narration, that silence is perhaps the most difficult and most necessary spiritual exercise of all. There's a study published in the journal Science in July 2014, conducted by the psychologist Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia, that illustrates this difficulty well. Participants were placed in an empty room with nothing to do for about 15 minutes. The only alternative was to press a button that would deliver a small electric shock to themselves. 67% of the men and 25% of the women chose to give themselves electric shocks rather than sit still with their own thoughts. That isn't an exception, it's a diagnosis. The contemporary human being cannot tolerate his own silence, and that intolerance is the foundation of almost everything he does to escape himself. There's a scene that repeats itself in almost every big city. The elevator rises in silence with 5 strangers inside. They're all looking at their phones. Nobody looks at the glass, at the floor, at their own face reflected in the mirrored doors. The elevator moves for 15 seconds, and in those 15 seconds, each one of them has to fill the void with something. A scroll through a feed, a check of a message, anything that avoids the discomfort of just standing in space with other human beings. Eckhart, if he saw that scene, probably wouldn't say anything. He'd just smile sadly. Because it's in that scene, repeated millions of times a day all over the world, that the sickness of our time reveals itself. It's not the lack of time. It's the impossibility of being. Detachment doesn't happen all at once. Eckhart understood this, even though his sermons sometimes give the opposite impression because of their intensity. Anyone who reads his collected work realizes that he was describing a path, not a switch. A person lets go gradually, first from the most obvious things, from possessions, from small habits, from cruder reactions. Then, slowly, from the more subtle layers, like the need for approval, identification with one's profession, and the constant projection into the future. And finally, from spirituality itself as an identity. Because there's a final trap that Eckhart also identified. A person starts practicing detachment and, before long, gets attached to the image of being a practitioner of detachment. He becomes the guy who meditates, who reads ancient texts, who speaks in elevated language, and that new identity is just as much a prison as the previous one. Maybe more, because it's harder to detect. The good news about this gradual process is that there's no possible failure. Every time you notice an attachment, that attachment has already begun to come undone, even if only slightly. Awareness is the first cut. No great heroism is required, nor giving everything up. You just have to start observing where the human being clings throughout the day, what he fears losing, what he demands, what he needs to happen in order to feel okay. Those observations, repeated with patience, over months and years, gradually produce an inner loosening. The ropes that seem so tight start to slacken without you noticing the exact moment it happened. One day, in a situation that would have caused suffering before, an unexpected calm shows up. And that calm isn't forced. It's the natural result of silent work that had been going on. That loosening has practical effects in every area. In relationships, the person begins to love with less demand. At work, he begins to produce with less anxiety. In relationships with parents, with children, with friends, a flexibility emerges that wasn't there before. There's less drama, less pressure, fewer scenes, and yet there's more presence, because what's lost in artificial intensity is gained in real depth. The people close to you notice. They can't name what changed, but they notice. There's something more solid in that human being. Something that seems to be whole in a way it wasn't before. And there's one more dimension, perhaps the most important. Whoever lets go starts living with less fear of death. Not because he loses the natural instinct of self-preservation, but because, as he lets go of surface identifications, the idea of losing those identifications becomes less threatening. Eckhart talked about this a lot. For him, the fear of death is, in large part, the fear of losing what one is clinging to. Reduce the clinging, and the fear is reduced along with it. It doesn't disappear, but it stops being in charge. And that reduction of fear allows for a way of living that wasn't possible before. A way that's less defensive, less calculating, less tense. A relaxation settles in at deep levels. And that relaxation is the soil where something genuinely human can flourish. The natural question at this point is how to begin. Not in theory, in practice. Eckhart didn't leave a manual of exercises. His work is predominantly speculative and contemplative, but the tradition that drew inspiration from him, especially in the centuries that followed, developed practical applications that still work today. Some of them are simple to the point of seeming naive, but simple doesn't mean easy. These practices require repetition, patience, and the courage to keep going even when it seems like nothing is happening. Detachment is a slow-growing plant. Whoever expects quick results doesn't notice the results that are already happening. The first practice is the non-judgmental observation of attachments. Throughout the day, noticing when the inner being contracts. When something triggers irritation, anxiety, fear, intense desire, don't fight those reactions. Don't be ashamed of them. Just notice. Look inward the way you'd look at a wild animal, with curiosity and respect, without trying to capture it. That simple gesture of observation, repeated over weeks, gradually creates a natural distance. The person realizes that she is not the reaction. There's her, and there's the reaction within her. That differentiation is the beginning of everything. Without it, Any other practice just becomes another form of identification, only now disguised as spirituality. The second practice is brief, daily silence. You don't have to do long retreats. 10 or 15 minutes a day of doing nothing is enough. Nothing at all. No meditation app, no ambient music, no specific technique. Just sit and put up with your own mind. At first, it'll be uncomfortable. Thoughts will come in waves. The body will want to move. Your hand will reach for the phone as if it were an extension of your arm. All of that is normal. The exercise isn't to eliminate those impulses. It's to observe them and not obey them. Over time, naturally, they decrease. And more importantly, the person decreases along with them. In a good way. He becomes smaller, quieter, more inhabitable to himself. The third practice is the conscious pause before reacting. This may be the most useful exercise for everyday life. When something triggers an immediate reaction, wait 3 seconds before responding. Just that. 3 seconds. Before answering the annoying message. Before snapping back at the coworker's comment. Before yelling at your kid. Before making the impulsive decision. Those 3 seconds are a concrete act of detachment. They insert a space between stimulus and response. And inside that space, choice can fit. Anyone who trains that pause for months discovers that gradually it expands. 3 seconds turn into 5, then 10. And before long, the person realizes she's living with more self-governance. That she's stopped being an object of her own emotions and gone back to being the subject of her own life. The fourth practice is letting go of one specific expectation per day. Consciously pick a situation where you're holding on to a rigid expectation and loosen it. Go to a restaurant and don't order what you always order. Leave the house without your phone for a short walk. Have a conversation without trying to steer the topic. Accept a suggestion you'd normally refuse. These small exercises seem trivial, but they train the inner being not to cling to scripts. And life, at its core, has no script. Whoever learns to live without a script lives better. Not because everything works perfectly, but because constant rigidity stops eating up energy that can be used for more important things. The fifth practice is writing down what you're afraid of losing. Grab a notebook and list, without filtering, everything whose loss seems unbearable. The job, the house, the relationship, your health, your reputation. And for each item, write calmly about what life would look like if that thing were lost. Not as masochism, but as an exercise in realistic imagination. What would happen? What would be left? How you'd survive? That exercise, which has roots in the Stoic tradition and which Eckhart would endorse without hesitation, has the effect of reducing the terror of loss. Most losses, when imagined in detail, lose their paralyzing power. They're still hard, but they stop being apocalyptic. And that drop in terror frees the human being to live with more courage right now. There's also a sixth practice, perhaps the hardest. It's detaching from your own opinions. In a culture saturated with argument, where each person seems obligated to hold a firm position on everything, letting go of the urgency of being right is an almost revolutionary act. It doesn't mean not thinking, it means thinking without identifying with the thought. Holding an opinion knowing it might be wrong. Listening to the opposing view without feeling attacked. Changing your mind when the facts change without feeling humiliated. That intellectual elasticity is a sophisticated form of disidentification, and it has profound effects. Anyone who practices it becomes more intelligent, more patient, easier to talk with, and rarer, in a world where almost no one does this. These 6 practices, combined and repeated, are the beginning of a path that Eckhart would describe as the opening of space for something real to appear. It isn't a formula. It isn't a promise of happiness. It's a training in presence. And presence in the end is all you have. Things come and go. People arrive and leave. Circumstances change constantly. The only stable ground is the quality of attention you bring to each moment. That quality can be cultivated, and detachment is the soil where it grows. There's something Eckhart said, with variations, in different sermons, that's worth holding on to. He stated that the sacred isn't in the hurried person, that the human being can only receive what is eternal when he stops chasing what is fleeting. Stripped of the religious vocabulary, the idea still holds in another language. Scattered attention doesn't notice what matters. A hurried life isn't lived. Whoever is always racing toward the next goal passes through everything without seeing anything, and gets to the end without actually having been there. That's the most common fate, and also the saddest. Not the lack of achievements, the lack of presence. People die with checked-off to-do lists and unlived lives. Eckhart asked that this pattern be interrupted. Not tomorrow, not when the conditions are perfect. Now, because no other moment exists. And it's also important to say something that often gets left out. Detachment is not the end of desire. Eckhart didn't ask anyone to turn into a stone. He asked them to free themselves from the slavery of desire, not to eliminate desire. There's a subtle but decisive difference. The detached man still wants things. He still builds, plans, pursues, but he does it from a different place. It doesn't come from need or fear, much less from hurry. It comes from a fullness that already exists before the desire. That's why what he builds is more solid, what he plans is more intelligent, and what he pursues has a different quality, more legitimate and less urgent. Desire stops being uncontrolled hunger and becomes a clear orientation, and that difference changes everything. The man who hasn't let go yet desires the way a drowning man clings to a piece of wreckage, with desperation, with terror of losing what he's holding. The detached man desires the way a gardener plants a seed, with care, knowing he might not see the plant grow, knowing so many things depend on factors outside his control, but planting anyway, with confidence, with seriousness, without neurotic urgency. That image of the two kinds of desire, while not directly from Eckhart, is consistent with everything he taught. And it may be one of the most practical ways to understand what he was trying to say. Eckhart probably died in 1328, before the papal bull officially condemned him. He was buried without much ceremony, at a time when his reputation had already been stained by ecclesiastical suspicions. For centuries, his work was barely read outside of small circles. Only in the 19th century, with the rediscovery of medieval mysticism by German philosophers, did he return to the center of European intellectual interest. Today, he's considered one of the greatest mystics in the West, but Eckhart has a particular quality that sets him apart from the others. He isn't devotional in the sentimental sense. He's cold. He's precise, almost philosophical. That's why he speaks so well to the modern mind, trained to be suspicious of emotional excess and to look for solid arguments. Whoever reads him today, in careful translations of modern critical editions, finds a thinker who seems to cross centuries without aging. His observations on silence, emptiness, presence, and detachment seem to have been written yesterday, as if he had anticipated, with stunning clarity, precisely the ills that would come to define the human being of the digital age. Information overload, the loss of depth, the slavery of appearances, and the chronic anxiety those things produce. All of that he was already mapping in sermons preached in German cities in the 14th century to people who couldn't imagine what was coming. There's something prophetic about him, though he never presented himself that way. And there is, above all, a proposal. Not a moral demand, not a threat of damnation, a proposal that the human being can live differently, that there is a way of being in the world that isn't the familiar slavery most people submit to, that this way doesn't require monasteries, mountains, or exotic lives. Just a slow, patient inner reorganization done in the middle of an ordinary day, between ordinary tasks, with ordinary people. Eckhart's detachment isn't for the enlightened. It's for anyone who has the discernment to notice that the automatic life isn't enough, and the courage to do something about it. The shift in perspective he offers is simple to state, but profound in its implications. Contemporary culture insists that the good life is the full life, full of experiences, of relationships, of belongings, of achievements, of trips, of visibility. Eckhart whispers the opposite. The good life is the liberated life, freed from excess, from hurry, from compulsive identification with everything that passes by. What makes a human being whole isn't what gets added on. It's what stops being carried. And whoever learns to let go discovers, with surprise, that he had far more energy, far more time, far more depth than he ever imagined. All of it was being spent holding on to what didn't need to be held. Detachment, then, is not the end of desire. It's the beginning of real presence. It's the difference between passing through life and actually being in life, between piling up days and inhabiting moments, between being a bundle of reactions and being someone actually. There's a stillness in the detached man that isn't apathy. It's the calm of someone who has come home inside himself. And once you've known that stillness, even briefly, it gets hard to go back to your previous life with the same level of commitment. Not because life changes dramatically on the outside, but because the relationship with it transforms on the inside. And that transformation is, in the end, the only miracle a human being has access to. The final question Eckhart leaves, without ever asking it directly, is a question each person has to ask themselves in silence. What, exactly, have you still not had the courage to let go of? It might be a person who left years ago, but who still lives inside your chest. It might be an old version of yourself, one that doesn't exist anymore, but that you still try to defend. It might be an expectation about your career, your family, the recognition you crave, which is eating up your attention every day without your even noticing. It might be the fear of a future loss that hasn't even happened yet. Whatever it is, it's there. And as long as it is, there's a part of you that can't breathe freely. That question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It just demands to be looked at straight on. And maybe, in the end, it's the most honest starting point for any path worth walking. If this video touched something inside you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel to keep reflecting with us on these ideas that cross centuries and still have so much to say, and consider becoming part of our members club to dive deeper into longer conversations, exclusive material, and a community that takes these topics seriously. The path of detachment starts with small choices, and maybe the next one can start right now.